1943. A slow convoy of olive-drab trucks rolled across the dusty perimeter road of Camp Swift, Texas. The sun hung low, turning the horizon into a pale sheet of white heat. Inside the trucks sat rows of German prisoners, Afrika Korps veterans, uniforms faded by desert wind, faces hollowed by months of fighting and surrender. They expected hard fences, barking guards, and the cold machinery of revenge. That was the picture painted for them by every leaflet, every briefing, every officer who insisted that capture by Americans meant humiliation. The trucks braked in front of the main gate. The men lifted their heads. Something strange caught their attention. A line of American soldiers stood beside a small wooden canteen. Air drifted out, carrying a smell none of the Germans recognized at first. Sweet, cold, almost unreal in the heat. Then they saw it, a line of POWs walking away from the counter, holding cups of soft, melting ice cream. Others carried glass bottles with dark liquid fizzing under red caps. The Germans stared through the wire, unable to process what they were seeing, a prison camp offering ice cream and Coca-Cola. And that disbelief marked the beginning of everything that would follow next. The shock German prisoners felt when they first stepped onto American soil did not appear out of nowhere. It was the product of two completely different worlds colliding, one shaped by total war, rationing, and the psychological machinery of the Third Reich, and the other defined by industrial abundance, wide farmland, and a society untouched by the devastation consuming Europe. To understand why ice cream and Coca-Cola could stun battle-hardened soldiers, the story must begin months before they ever saw the inside of an American POW camp. By early 1943, the German war machine was cracking. The Afrika Korps, once a symbol of mobility and tactical brilliance, was trapped between Allied pressure and diminishing supplies. When entire units surrendered in Tunisia, tens of thousands of prisoners were suddenly in Allied hands. Britain and its colonies could not house all of them. The United States, with its vast land and logistical capacity, agreed to take the largest share. For German soldiers, the idea of being shipped across the Atlantic felt like a descent into an unknown they had been trained to fear. Inside Germany, propaganda painted a very specific picture of American captivity. Radio broadcasts and military briefings described the United States as a land of chaos, racial violence, and moral collapse, governed by industrialists and ruled by money. Officers repeated that captured soldiers would be forced into brutal labor, starved, humiliated, stripped of dignity. The myth served a purpose. Soldiers who feared the enemy were less likely to surrender. As the war dragged on, fear became a strategic tool. But the United States had built its POW system on a completely different foundation, one shaped by the 1929 Geneva Convention. Washington understood that the treatment of Axis prisoners had diplomatic weight. If Americans mistreated Germans, Germany could retaliate against American airmen and ground troops captured in Europe. This calculation produced a strict policy: feed German prisoners the same ration scale as American troops, allow them recreation, maintain discipline without cruelty, and ensure medical care that met military standards. The War Department issued layered guidelines, and camp commanders were expected to follow them exactly. By the time the first large waves of German POWs arrived in 1943, the United States had already begun constructing more than 500 camps across the country. These camps were typically placed near military bases, agricultural regions, or large industrial centers. Wooden barracks were built in precise rows. Wire fences were erected to military specification. Guard towers rose above the perimeter, manned mostly by older soldiers or younger recruits unfit for overseas combat. To the American guards, the German prisoners were not mythical enemies. They were workers, laborers, and military personnel who needed to be managed, fed, and kept in order. The contrast began immediately upon arrival. Many German prisoners stepped off the transports expecting shouts, beatings, or public humiliation. Instead, they saw structure, lines, checks, medical evaluations, a military routine that resembled their own. The shock deepened when they were issued clean clothes, inspected for illness, and directed toward barracks that, while simple, were orderly and solid. In those first minutes, the ground under their expectations began to shift. The broader context of American society intensified that shift. Unlike Europe, the United States had not been bombed. Its cities still glowed with neon signs at night, its factories operated at full capacity, its farms produced more food than the military could consume. This abundance flowed into the camps through regulated supply chains. Prisoners encountered staples they had not seen in years. White bread, canned fruit, butter, meat served regularly. They saw American soldiers receiving the same meals, standing in the same lines, following the same routines. The idea that their captors lived in prosperity while Europe starved was difficult to reconcile with anything they had been taught. Another factor transformed their early impressions: the sheer distance from the battlefield. In the United States, the war existed mostly through newspapers, radio, and training programs. Civilians lived next to POW camps without fear of enemy attack. Children biked past fences. Farmers chatted with guards. The environment lacked the constant tension that defined Europe. To German prisoners, this calm felt unreal, not because they believed Americans were peaceful, but because war had consumed their world so completely that normal life seemed impossible. Yet, beneath the order and abundance, there were strict boundaries. Discipline inside the camps was firm. Violations were punished, escapes were monitored, and camp commanders enforced regulations with military precision. But these restrictions existed within a system that still granted leisure time, sports, reading materials, and structured labor. What shocked the prisoners was not the discipline, it was the humanity wrapped around it. This environment became the stage on which their expectations collapsed, and their perception of America began to change. The moment they encountered things they had believed impossible, food variety, personal freedom within the camp, and everyday items unavailable in wartime Europe, the psychological impact was immediate and profound. And it was within this shifting landscape that the first signs of deeper transformation began to appear, leading directly into the next layer of context that shaped their experience even further. The American POW system gained its distinct character from geography, resources, and a national infrastructure that functioned without interruption. Each region produced a different texture of captivity. Camps in the south sat under wide, open skies, surrounded by cotton fields, cattle ranches, and long lines of rail track feeding the agricultural economy. Camps in the Midwest operated near grain silos, processing plants, and military depots. Camps in the West existed beside desert training grounds and sprawling logistics hubs. The environment shaped daily life, but the underlying system remained uniform, regulated, supplied, and monitored at a scale only the United States could sustain during the war. Food distribution defined that system. American rations, even with wartime limitations, exceeded anything available in Europe by 1943. Cooks in POW camps received bulk shipments of flour, vegetables, canned goods, meat, sugar, and coffee. German POW cooks, allowed under Geneva rules to prepare meals for their own men, worked with ingredients they had not seen since before the war. Prisoners noticed that shortages were minimal. They also noticed something that altered their perspective. Other American guards ate identical meals, no special treatment, no deprivation imposed as punishment. Supply officers followed the manual without interpretation. The Red Cross acted as an additional stabilizer. Inspections ensured compliance with the Geneva Convention. Reports documented camp conditions. Parcel deliveries supplemented nutrition and provided tobacco, clothing, and reading materials. German prisoners accustomed to a state-controlled information environment saw neutral officials walking freely through camps, speaking with them directly, and filing reports without interference. This external presence validated what they were experiencing. The camp conditions were not temporary, accidental, or staged. They were standard. Inside the barracks, differences between American and German military culture surfaced. German soldiers were trained under rigid hierarchy and constant disciplinary pressure. American camp regulations enforced order, but without theatrical displays of authority. Guards operated on schedules, paperwork, and protocols instead of intimidation. Orders were enforced, but emotional distance was maintained. For prisoners who expected cruelty, the absence of it produced cognitive conflict. They were still captives. They were still the defeated enemy. Yet they were treated with a functional respect that contradicted every warning they had received. Work details accelerated the shift. The United States used POW labor to compensate for manpower shortages in agriculture and industry. German prisoners harvested crops, repaired fences, cut timber, and operated machinery under supervision. The work was structured, not punitive. Compensation was symbolic but regulated, scrip for canteens, allowing prisoners to purchase toiletries, stationery, and small comforts. Work took them beyond the fences and into American towns, exposing them to a civilian world untouched by destruction. The effect was cumulative. German soldiers saw intact farms, stocked grocery stores and households with electricity, radios, and cars. They saw civilians who carried no visible scars from war. What they encountered was not luxury but stability, an uninterrupted life they had forgotten existed. This contrast created internal dissonance. The enemy country they were taught to despise appeared to function with order and prosperity, while their own nation struggled to sustain itself. American consumer culture amplified this effect. Items considered ordinary in the United States carried symbolic weight for prisoners. Ice cream represented freshness and industrial capacity. Coca-Cola represented mass production and widespread distribution. Both products required cold storage, sugar supply, and transportation networks that Germany could no longer sustain. These objects were not luxuries in an American sense. They were indicators of a system operating at full strength. Psychological tension surfaced in subtle ways. Some prisoners interpreted the abundance as propaganda designed to demoralize them. Others saw it as evidence that German leadership had lied about enemy decline. A number of officers refused to acknowledge the difference, clinging to the party narrative even inside captivity. But enlisted men, especially younger soldiers, processed the change quickly. Diaries recorded the moment realization took hold. The war they were fighting was not between collapsing states. It was between a strained nation and one with reserves far beyond expectation. American authorities understood the strategic value of this perception. Humane treatment was not generosity. It was a calculated demonstration of capability. Civility communicated power more effectively than brutality. Order demonstrated competence. Abundance revealed industrial superiority. The system operated with a clarity of purpose, maintained compliance with international law, preserved discipline, and quietly displayed the strength of the American home front. By late 1943, this combination of environment, regulation, and exposure produced a consistent pattern across dozens of camps. German POWs entered believing they would face hardship. They discovered a controlled, stable world that contradicted everything they had been told. And this discovery set the stage for the deeper angles that would define their transformation. The first and most immediate angle of the German POW experience was psychological. They entered the camps carrying months or years of indoctrination. The message had been repeated endlessly: America was unstable, violent, governed by chaos and commercial greed. In this imagined version of the United States, prisoners would be treated harshly, forced into backbreaking labor, and stripped of their dignity. But the reality they encountered dissolved those expectations within days. Barracks were plain but solid. Medical staff conducted examinations without hostility. Meals arrived with regularity. Guards enforced discipline through procedure, not threats. For many, this produced a cognitive split. German soldiers had endured the fear of being captured by a force their own government portrayed as barbaric. Yet here they stood, receiving humane treatment from an enemy they had been taught to hate. The experience created internal confusion that diaries captured with precise honesty. Men wrote that they did not understand the motivation behind the system. They discussed whether it was a trick or an attempt at manipulation. They wondered if they were seeing something temporary, a stage set for propaganda photographs. But as days became weeks and weeks became months, the pattern held. Stability replaced suspicion. The shock deepened when they realized that American guards treated them with the same procedural respect they extended to one another. The system was not personal, it was structural. The United States handled prisoners as a logistical obligation, not a matter of emotional revenge. This depersonalization unnerved some prisoners at first. Over time, it produced something else, an unsettling sense that their enemy operated with confidence rather than desperation. Small comforts, like access to books, sports, or canteen privileges, reinforced this perception. The psychological shift became a quiet turning point. The war they believed they understood was not the war they were living inside anymore. The next angle emerged from cultural encounters. German prisoners had lived through years of rationing and political control. Many came from cities that had experienced air raids, blackouts, and shortages. In contrast, the American landscape, visible through camp fences or work details, seemed untouched by the pressures of war. Towns appeared orderly. Stores were stocked. Newspapers circulated freely. This environment carried the power of a revelation. Inside the camps, cultural contrast appeared in ordinary details. American guards drank Coca-Cola openly. POW canteens sold it through regulated scrip. Ice cream appeared at organized intervals, served from insulated containers. These products were not symbols of indulgence for Americans. They were part of everyday life. But to the prisoners, they represented industrial capacity that Germany no longer possessed. Producing ice cream required refrigeration infrastructure, sugar allocation, agricultural surplus, and transportation networks. Coca-Cola required bottling facilities, glass production, and widespread distribution. The prisoners understood logistics. They knew what it meant for a nation at war to allocate resources to non-essential items. This contrast produced a cultural shock that extended into deeper observations. They saw American guards using radios, cameras, cigarettes, and personal items freely available in stores. They watched children outside the fences riding bicycles or carrying toys. They noted that, even during wartime, American civilians enjoyed stability and predictability, conditions unimaginable in Germany by 1944. These observations reshaped their view of the enemy's society. It was not immoral or collapsing. It was organized and materially confident. Gradually, prisoners began to study American life from the inside. They observed speech patterns, religious habits, and the informality of social interactions. The openness with which Americans expressed opinions contrasted sharply with the controlled atmosphere of the Third Reich. Even the relaxed posture of guards, leaning against railings, talking casually, signaled a society that did not fear internal collapse. This cultural encounter, conducted through small details and daily routines, became a quiet lesson in the difference between propaganda and lived reality. A third angle emerged not from emotion, but from technical observation. Many German POWs were trained soldiers. Some were mechanics, engineers, or logisticians. They understood supply chains, ammunition shortages, vehicle wear, and the complexity of sustaining a modern army. When they entered American camps, they found a logistical ecosystem functioning with precision and abundance. Food arrived on schedule. Medical supplies were never insufficient. Clothing stocks remained consistent. Trucks moved in and out with predictable rhythm. Even the maintenance of camp infrastructure, water systems, electricity, kitchens, demonstrated organization at scale. To soldiers who had experienced the shortages of the Afrika Korps or the failing supply networks of the Eastern Front, this consistency carried meaning. It revealed an enemy whose industrial base was not strained, but expanding. They saw evidence of this everywhere. American military vehicles were well maintained and plentiful. Civilian farms produced enough crops to supply both domestic markets and POW camps. Factories operated at capacity without signs of material stress. When prisoners worked in agricultural or industrial details, they interacted with equipment and machinery built in vast quantities. Even simple items, nails, tools, spare parts, were readily available. In Germany, these goods had become scarce, regulated, or repurposed for war production. This operational efficiency influenced how POWs evaluated the broader conflict. Many concluded that Germany could not sustain a long war against a nation with such depth of resources. Their letters and diaries referenced the realization that American industry was not only outproducing Germany, but doing so while maintaining civilian comforts. This understanding did not immediately alter loyalty, but it introduced doubt, an awareness that they were fighting a country capable of absorbing losses, supplying armies across oceans, and still producing ice cream for prison camps. Through these angles, the foundation was laid for the turning points that would follow, when perception shifted from confusion to recognition, and then to something deeper. A fourth angle emerged when German POWs began comparing their treatment in the United States to what they knew of Germany's own practices. Many prisoners had served in regions where Allied captives were held under strict or hostile conditions, especially in Eastern theaters. They were familiar with the ideology that shaped German military behavior: discipline enforced through fear, political loyalty demanded by the party, and the assumption that enemies deserved no comfort. When they entered American camps, they confronted a system that operated on the opposite principle. Rules were enforced, but cruelty was absent. Order was maintained, but not through intimidation. This contrast carried a moral weight. It forced prisoners to confront the difference between propaganda narratives and practical behavior. Some reacted defensively, insisting that the Americans used humane treatment as psychological manipulation. Others attempted to rationalize it by claiming the United States wanted to display superiority through indulgence. But the consistency of American policy wore through these arguments. The treatment they received was not dependent on mood or nationality. It followed written procedures. It aligned with international law. It was not extraordinary, it was standard. Officers found themselves in a complicated position. Their ideological training pushed them to reject any sign of American civility. But enlisted men, workers, and younger soldiers saw the situation plainly. They recognized that German propaganda had not prepared them for this reality. The moral comparison became a point of tension inside the camps, dividing prisoners into factions, those who clung to the party narrative and those who quietly acknowledged that the United States appeared to uphold the values Germany claimed only in theory. This contrast did not generate admiration. It produced something more subtle, an internal reckoning. The prisoners had entered the camps believing they were morally and culturally superior to their enemies. When confronted with consistent, regulated, and humane treatment, they were forced to reconsider that assumption. This moral angle shaped the deeper psychological shifts that would follow in the later stages of captivity. The fifth angle was tactical rather than emotional. American authorities recognized early that humane treatment had strategic value. It fostered compliance, it reduced tension, it encouraged cooperation subtly, without coercion. Intelligence officers understood that prisoners who felt physically secure were more likely to talk, even if casually. They also realized that exposure to American abundance could undermine the ideological certainty German soldiers carried with them. This strategy did not manifest through direct interrogation. Instead, it appeared in the structure of daily life. Work assignments brought prisoners into contact with American civilians under controlled conditions. Recreational activities created informal opportunities for conversation among soldiers and guards. Red Cross inspections established credibility that bypassed German attempts to control information. Newspapers were available. Radios broadcast news from neutral sources. The environment allowed prisoners to gather facts independently rather than relying on rumors. Some prisoners, especially those trained in security or propaganda, recognized the framework. They instructed others to remain silent, avoid friendliness, and maintain ideological discipline. But the camp system itself minimized their influence. Prisoners interacted with the American way of life in too many small ways for officers to control. They saw full markets on work details. They heard civilians discuss wages and crop yields. They observed that most Americans carried little fear of the war entering their homeland. These observations shaped intelligence outcomes more effectively than formal interrogation. The prisoners began comparing the American home front to their memories of Germany. They noted the difference in supplies, morale, and industrial scale. Many concluded, quietly, that Germany was fighting a war it could not win. This realization did not depend on speeches or persuasion. It came from routine exposure to an enemy operating far above what prisoners had been taught to expect. The strategic angle played its role silently, but its impact was long-lasting. When the war neared its end, many POWs understood the broader situation with clarity, shaped directly by what they had witnessed inside American camps. The final angle came from individual reactions, moments captured in diaries, letters, and post-war interviews. Despite variations between camps, a consistent theme appeared across testimonies: surprise. German prisoners wrote openly about the things that struck them hardest: the taste of cold ice cream after months in the desert, the sound of fizzy Coca-Cola bottles, the sight of American guards eating the same meals as the prisoners, the calmness of everyday life outside the fences. These small experiences carried disproportionate emotional weight. One former POW described his disbelief when he saw American children receiving milk and fruit daily. Another wrote about his shock when a guard handed him a cigarette without hesitation. Others recalled the feeling of walking into a camp canteen for the first time, seeing shelves holding items they thought impossible to obtain during wartime. Even ordinary conversations with guards made lasting impressions. The Americans did not speak with hostility. They asked simple questions about hometowns, families, or service. These exchanges left prisoners with an unexpected sense of normalcy. Human interactions inside the camps gradually reshaped the atmosphere. Sports created camaraderie, even without mixing nationalities. Music, books, and organized activities broke down internal barriers among prisoners. The monotony of camp life softened the rigidity of military identity. Over time, the men stopped viewing themselves solely as soldiers of a collapsing regime. They became individuals observing an unfamiliar society from within its boundaries. These personal experiences bore long-term weight. Many former POWs later recalled their captivity, not as a period of suffering, but as a turning point in their understanding of the world. Their memories reflected something rare in wartime, a human connection formed despite the roles assigned to them as enemies. Through these angles, the foundations of the later turning point were established, when POWs would move from confusion to recognition and from recognition to a deeper understanding of the world they were confronting. The turning point did not arrive in a single dramatic moment. It emerged gradually, shaped by a pattern of small encounters that accumulated until the truth became impossible for the prisoners to ignore. By late 1944, the United States was receiving larger numbers of German POWs captured in France and the Low Countries. These men came from units that had experienced the tightening collapse of German logistics, fuel shortages, broken supply lines, and improvised defenses against an enemy advancing with overwhelming materiel. When these soldiers entered American custody, they carried a perspective shaped by exhaustion, attrition, and the hard weight of retreat. The first wave of realization began when prisoners assigned to work details left the boundaries of their camps. Many had not expected to see the interior of the United States outside the fences. As trucks rolled through towns toward farms or industrial sites, the men stared out at streets lined with intact houses and shops. Cars moved freely. Market stalls displayed fruit and vegetables in quantities they had not seen in years. No buildings bore bomb damage. No smoke rose from distant fires. The landscape held no signs of war beyond the occasional military convoy or recruitment poster. It felt as though the conflict consuming Europe was an ocean away, geographically and psychologically. Work details placed prisoners into environments that magnified these impressions. On farms, they saw grain harvests carried out with modern machinery instead of manpower. They handled tools that looked freshly manufactured, not repurposed from older equipment. American farmers, operating under wartime demands yet supported by functioning supply chains, produced yields far beyond what German agriculture could sustain by 1944. For POWs accustomed to ration cards and shortages, the abundance was impossible to ignore. Inside small factories and processing plants, the contrast sharpened. Conveyor belts, packaging machines, and refrigeration units operated with a smoothness that reflected continuous maintenance and reliable production rhythms. German mechanics and engineers recognized the implications immediately. A nation capable of operating industrial systems at that scale during war had reserves far deeper than anything Germany could match. The realization was not ideological, it was practical, technical, and rooted in the professional understanding of men who had spent their military careers watching equipment break down from lack of fuel, parts, or transport. The decisive shift came when prisoners began seeing American civilians interact with these systems. Workers moved with confidence, not urgency. They discussed wages, holidays, and personal concerns rather than shortages or bombings. The sense of normal life, unbroken, steady, contradicted every narrative the prisoners had been fed. Germany had insisted that the United States was weak-willed, decadent, divided by internal conflict. Yet here was a society operating with calm predictability while fighting a global war on two fronts. Inside the camps, the transformation continued. Canteens stocked with ice cream and Coca-Cola no longer seemed like anomalies. They became symbols of a deeper reality. The United States possessed the industrial ability to allocate resources to both military operations and civilian comforts without strain. The Germans measured the significance of this quietly, privately. Many had served in units that rationed ammunition, fuel, or even food during the final years of the campaign. To watch American guards drink Coca-Cola during breaks, without ceremony, revealed a gap in capacity wider than any battlefield map could show. Letters home captured this turning point, though often in cautious language. Prisoners hinted at conditions without violating the limits imposed by censors. They wrote that food was sufficient, that work was fair, that treatment was stable. Some added subtle lines reflecting their shock: a bottle of cold soda on a hot afternoon, a bowl of ice cream served without occasion, a work detail that ended early because supervisors insisted on humane hours. These observations carried a power that official statements could not suppress. They spread inside the barracks, shifting attitudes one conversation at a time. The atmosphere inside the camps changed with the growing recognition. Tension softened. Daily routines became predictable rather than stressful. Some prisoners, especially younger ones, began learning English, not as a political gesture but out of curiosity. Others engaged more openly with guards during work details, asking questions about wages, education, or the American states. These exchanges remained within formal boundaries, yet they revealed a growing familiarity that neither side fully planned but both acknowledged. The moment of transformation became clearest when prisoners began discussing the war honestly among themselves. Soldiers from elite formations, who once spoke with unwavering confidence, now admitted the obvious. The United States was not the caricature Germany had built. It was industrially superior, socially cohesive, and materially stable. The ice cream and Coca-Cola that had stunned them upon arrival were not luxuries. They were indicators of a war economy functioning far beyond Germany's reach. By the end of 1944, the psychological foundation of the POW experience had shifted. The captives no longer saw themselves as soldiers temporarily removed from the battlefield. They saw themselves as men standing inside the borders of a nation far stronger, more organized, and more resilient than the one they had served. This realization did not erase loyalty, but it permanently altered perception. And as the final year of the war unfolded, that altered perception would deepen even further, shaping the most decisive turning points of their captivity. The shift became unmistakable once winter settled over the camps. Snow blanketed the barracks, the watchtowers, the open yards where the prisoners marched to roll call each morning. Yet even in the coldest months, the routines of American life continued with a steadiness that unsettled the German POWs far more than any hardship could have. Supply trucks arrived on schedule. The kitchens never ran short on ingredients. Work details continued, not with desperation, but with organization, measured, deliberate, efficient. For many prisoners, the most significant turning point unfolded not in dramatic confrontations, but in the quiet contrast between their expectations and the world they observed daily. They had believed that the United States, stretched across two oceans and fighting in Europe and the Pacific, would struggle under the weight of global war. Instead, they watched as towns decorated shop windows for Christmas, as families gathered in churches, as children played on sidewalks wearing warm coats and new boots. Even under rationing, civilian life appeared intact, almost comfortable. Inside the camps, the holiday season brought its own revelations. American guards did not behave like conquerors. Many were reservists or older men assigned to home duty. Some shared small gestures that carried immense weight. A cup of hot coffee poured for a prisoner working an early shift, a handful of spare cigarettes left intentionally on a table, a Christmas hymn hummed softly during night patrols. These moments were subtle, but for men who had been immersed in years of propaganda, they were disarming. The camp commandants enforced the Geneva Convention strictly. Meals were consistent, medical care was reliable, punishments, when they occurred, followed procedure rather than cruelty. Many prisoners had braced themselves for brutality, convinced that they would be starved or beaten. But nothing of the sort happened. Instead, they encountered a system that operated with rules that even the guards seemed bound to. The realization that their captors viewed them as human beings, not ideological enemies, struck deeper than any lecture could have. The ideological cracks widened during work details that brought prisoners into contact with American workers more regularly. In one camp, prisoners assigned to a lumber mill learned that their daily production barely registered within the plant's overall output. The mill ran multiple shifts staffed by hundreds of American civilians using machinery that dwarfed anything the Germans had operated. The POWs worked hard, as soldiers accustomed to discipline, but they could not escape the truth their contribution was a drop of water in an ocean of American manufacturing power. In another camp, German electricians were assigned to help maintain equipment at a food processing plant. Here they saw refrigeration systems so extensive that the cold rooms were the size of small warehouses. One POW, a technician from Hamburg, remarked quietly to his comrades that Germany lacked the copper reserves to build even a fraction of such infrastructure during wartime. His words spread quickly. They were not spoken with admiration, only with the blunt clarity of a man recognizing a reality too large to deny. The emotional turning point for many prisoners emerged not from work or observation but from the conversations that took place in the barracks long after lights out. Soldiers who had served on the Eastern Front began describing the horrors they had witnessed. Starvation, destroyed villages, endless retreat. Others who had fought in North Africa spoke of supply shortages that crippled their campaigns. In the dim light of a single bulb, these stories merged with what they were now seeing in America. The contrast grew impossible to reconcile with the confident speeches delivered by German officers only months earlier. Some prisoners began questioning long-held assumptions. If the United States possessed this level of organization, industry, and morale, what hope did Germany truly have? How long had their leadership known the war was unwinnable? How many lives had been lost simply to delay an inevitable defeat? Letters from home, filtered through censors yet still revealing, added another layer to the transformation. Families wrote of bombings, evacuations, rationing beyond anything previously experienced, and the collapse of transportation networks. One prisoner received a letter describing how his mother waited 4 hours to buy a loaf of bread. Another read that his village had been evacuated after an air raid destroyed half the houses. These fragmented updates contrasted sharply with the stable world surrounding them in the United States. For many, guilt mingled with confusion. They were safe, fed, and spared the devastation that their families faced daily. By early 1945, the psychological shift reached its peak. Some prisoners began volunteering for re-education lectures offered by the U.S. War Department, not out of forced compliance, but genuine curiosity. They wanted to understand the world beyond the ideological framework they had grown up in. These classes presented topics on democracy, labor rights, and international cooperation. While not all POWs accepted the ideas, many were struck by the openness of discussion, a stark contrast to the censorship and rigidity of the system they had served. More significant than lectures, however, was the simple accumulation of lived experience. The United States had not broken them through coercion, it had disarmed them through normalcy. A nation that could afford calm, a society that could sustain abundance, a military that followed rules, and an economy that worked without interruption. This was the turning point, the slow realization that they were standing inside a world fundamentally different from the one they had come from. A world that revealed Germany's defeat, not in combat, but in comparison. What crystallized the transformation was not one moment, but a pattern, consistent, undeniable, and far more persuasive than any leaflet dropped from a bomber. The prisoners watched the American war machine move with a steadiness that revealed the true balance of global power. Train lines bringing grain from the Midwest ran day and night. Factories in neighboring towns expanded their shifts instead of reducing them. Fuel trucks rolled in without interruption, even under strict rationing. The sense of deprivation that Germans knew intimately simply did not exist here. The POWs saw women leading complex factory operations with confidence, earned through years of work. They saw elderly men maintaining heavy equipment with the ease of long experience. They saw teenagers repairing tractors, driving trucks, or delivering supplies to the camps without hesitation. Every age group contributed. Every community participated, and every person, civilian or soldier, seemed anchored by a belief that the war would be won, because the nation had the capacity to win it. In the barracks, This reality created a quiet rupture between the soldiers who still clung to the remnants of propaganda and those who had abandoned it entirely. Some argued bitterly that what they saw was a facade meant to demoralize them. But their arguments weakened with each new observation, each truckload of fresh produce, each newspaper filled with advertisements for goods still available, each letter describing life in towns untouched by the devastation Germany experienced daily. The turning point sharpened further when groups of German POWs were assigned to work on local farms during the spring of 1945. For many, it was their first prolonged exposure to ordinary American households. Farmers greeted them without fear, sometimes even with a nod of acknowledgement. Some families left pitchers of cold milk on porches for the prisoners working nearby. At one farm, a group of POWs repairing a fence line were handed sandwiches by the farmer's wife, not out of sympathy, but out of simple routine courtesy. It was the kind of gesture that in wartime Germany would have been unthinkable toward enemy soldiers, and at several farms another symbol cut through their assumptions entirely: refrigerators, large, humming, reliable machines that stored milk, meat, vegetables, running around the clock in homes across the countryside. Some Germans had never seen one, even before the war. Germany produced refrigeration equipment, but civilian access shrank dramatically after 1939. A man who had seen families in Hamburg lose entire food stores after air raids knocked out electricity. The idea of a household appliance capable of preserving food through blackouts was staggering. If refrigerators revealed America's domestic advantage, then one detail revealed its cultural one: the children. German POWs saw them walking to school in clean clothes, carrying lunches packed with peanut butter, sandwiches, fruit, and small desserts. They heard them laughing in fields, playing baseball, practicing instruments. These scenes contradicted every message they had been fed about American moral decay or social collapse. Instead, they saw a generation growing up with stability, something war-torn Europe could not provide. The most profound moment for many POWs came in the spring of 1945, when news of Germany's collapse began filtering into the camps. Not through announcements, but through the stunned silence of guards reading telegrams, through newspapers pinned to bulletin boards, through the shifting tone of conversations at work sites. When the prisoners finally learned of Hitler's death, they reacted not with shock, but with a heavy, resigned clarity. They had already seen the truth here. The news only confirmed what their eyes had been telling them for months. But the single event that crystallized the turning point in emotional terms occurred in several camps almost simultaneously: the distribution of victory mail letters from Germany after surrender. These letters, written by family members in the ruins of bombed cities, described hunger, sickness, displacement, and fear of the future. They spoke of destroyed homes, missing fathers, lost brothers, vanished neighborhoods. Some letters carried no words at all, only short, broken messages scrawled on scraps of paper. One prisoner quietly folded his letter and said, "My family has seen the war, I have not." This comparison between their safety and their family's suffering forced them to confront a truth far more painful than defeat: they had been protected by the side they were taught to hate. The emotional weight grew heavier when American guards offered their condolences to prisoners who learned of lost relatives. The gestures were simple: a quiet nod, a soft statement, a brief pause before returning to duty. But these human reactions shattered the last remnants of the belief that Americans saw Germans as subhuman enemies. By late 1945, the transformation was complete. The prisoners now understood the scale, discipline, and moral consistency of the society holding them. They knew that America's strength lay not merely in its weapons or factories, but in its stability, its ability to function even under the pressure of global conflict. Many no longer measured the war in battles, but in systems, and by that measure, the outcome had been inevitable long before they realized it. This realization set the stage for everything that followed: the long months of waiting for repatriation, the complicated emotions of returning to a shattered homeland, and the lingering question of what their captivity had truly meant. The surrender of Germany did not end the experience of captivity for the prisoners. Repatriation was a slow process, and in the meantime, the POWs remained inside camps that had become strange enclaves of stability amid a world still in chaos. By mid-1945, the majority of German soldiers in the United States had internalized the pattern they had first observed upon arrival. Discipline paired with humanity, abundance paired with control. This realization shaped their behavior in ways that American authorities had anticipated but did not need to enforce through coercion. Inside the camps, morale shifted subtly. The initial shock of ice cream and Coca-Cola had long since become routine. Yet the men now approached their days with a reflective calm. Work details continued, repairing fences, harvesting crops, assisting in light manufacturing. But the tasks carried a new weight. They were no longer merely prisoners performing obligatory labor. They were witnesses to a functioning society whose strength they could measure directly. Diaries from the time describe a mixture of awe, resentment, and a reluctant admiration for the efficiency they observed. American guards noticed the change. Incidents of unrest, previously possible among large groups of prisoners frustrated by confinement, became rare. The combination of humane treatment, consistent routines, and exposure to the outside world produced a population of captives who were compliant, cooperative, and increasingly contemplative. Some engaged in small educational programs offered by the War Department, attending lectures on American history, labor systems, and civic structures. These lessons reinforced the prisoners' growing awareness that the society surrounding them was fundamentally different from the one they had left behind. Outside observers also recorded the effect of American camp policy. Red Cross inspections documented well-maintained facilities, consistent rations, and effective medical care. Officers reported that the prisoners were healthier, better fed, and more disciplined than many Allied troops returning from the front lines. One official memorandum noted that POWs exhibit a level of compliance and reflection rarely observed in similar populations abroad. The consistency of this observation across multiple camps highlighted the broader impact of the American approach. Humane treatment was not merely ethical, it was operationally effective. The contrast with Europe remained a constant backdrop. Letters from home, often delayed for weeks, carried accounts of destruction, deprivation, and displacement. Prisoners compared these accounts to the orderly and abundant environment around them. Some described a lingering sense of guilt for having survived relatively unscathed, while families endured hardship. Others reflected on the inefficiency of German logistical systems, realizing that the industrial and civilian capacity of the United States had already made the outcome of the war increasingly predictable by the time they had arrived. The human angle deepened as prisoners formed their own internal hierarchies within the camps. Officers attempted to maintain control over ideology and discipline, but enlisted men, shaped by months of exposure to American normalcy, quietly challenged long-held beliefs. Discussions in barracks about strategy, logistics, and the broader conduct of the war revealed a collective reassessment. Many POWs began to think not as soldiers embedded in propaganda, but as observers capable of understanding the practical realities of global conflict. By the end of 1945, as repatriation began in earnest, these patterns had hardened. The prisoners carried with them not just physical memories of the camps, the ice cream, Coca-Cola, orderly barracks, and functioning work details, but also a cognitive imprint of a society that could operate at scale, even under pressure. This imprint would inform post-war attitudes toward the United States and influence the way returning soldiers perceived the collapse of Germany. The combination of consistent policy, exposure to industrial capacity, and humanized treatment had achieved its purpose. German prisoners left American soil with a fundamentally altered understanding of their enemy, one rooted not in ideology or rumor, but in the tangible reality of everyday life. This shift in perception, cumulative and subtle, set the stage for the second phase of the aftermath, the long-term consequences on repatriation, psychological adjustment, and post-war reflection. Repatriation began in late 1945, transporting German prisoners back to a homeland unrecognizable in many ways. For soldiers who had spent months or years inside American camps, the contrast was staggering. Cities lay in ruins, infrastructure destroyed by air raids, transportation networks shattered, and families displaced. The orderly and abundant life they had experienced in the United States stood in sharp opposition to the devastation awaiting them. Diaries from returning POWs frequently described a sense of disbelief and disorientation. Some wrote of standing in the rubble of their hometowns, recalling the neat streets and stock stores they had left behind, and feeling the profound weight of loss and absence. Psychologically, many POWs faced complex emotions. The consistent care, reliable food, and humane treatment they had received in America left them with lingering admiration for their former captors, even as they grappled with the collapse of their own country. This duality created a mixture of guilt, awe, and re-evaluation of prior beliefs. Some officers found it difficult to reconcile their indoctrination with the reality of American civility. Enlisted men, however, often reflected more openly on the efficiency, order, and humanity they had witnessed, recording in letters and memoirs the unprecedented experience of captivity that had preserved their dignity. The effect extended beyond individual perception. Communities in Germany, ravaged by conflict, became arenas in which returning POWs' experiences influenced local understanding of the world beyond the Reich. Letters describing American camp life, its abundance, medical care, and structured routines circulated informally among families and friends. These accounts, though often cautious, provided early comparative narratives that contradicted Nazi propaganda. Young men returning from camps carried a cognitive framework shaped by months of exposure to a functioning society, offering a window into a different model of organization, governance, and resource management. Operationally, the aftermath highlighted the success of the American POW system as a strategic tool. By combining humanitarian treatment with regulated exposure to civilian life and industrial productivity, the United States not only ensured compliance and stability within the camps, but also facilitated a subtle shift in perception among the prisoners. Former POWs later recounted that their American captors had demonstrated that discipline, abundance, and morality could coexist, a lesson that remained embedded in their understanding of modern nation-states. The return to Germany underscored the starkness of the contrast. Many POWs immediately observed rationing lines, destroyed buildings, and shortages of essentials they had taken for granted while in America. Sugar, milk, and bread were difficult to acquire. Coal shortages left homes cold in winter. Electricity was intermittent. For those who had worked on American farms or in factories, the gap was both practical and psychological. They carried with them detailed knowledge of systems and logistics that Germany no longer possessed, a silent lesson in the consequences of industrial and administrative failure. This transition produced long-term reflections. Former prisoners maintained memories of camp life as a benchmark against which to measure the post-war reconstruction of Germany. Their first-hand experience of abundance, efficient governance, and humane treatment became a touchstone in their personal histories and, in some cases, contributed to post-war planning, civic engagement, and advocacy for systemic reform. POWs recognized that what they had once assumed to be enemy indulgence was, in fact, a reflection of the strength of organized society operating under pressure. In this way, the aftermath extended beyond the immediate war. The combination of observation, experience, and reflection shaped perceptions of morality, efficiency, and industrial capacity. German soldiers returned home not only to witness destruction, but also to internalize lessons about the interplay between governance, resources, and social stability. These lessons, derived from months of disciplined exposure to American systems, influenced post-war memory, narratives, and for some, the future reconstruction of their communities. The cumulative effect of captivity, exposure, and return set the stage for reflection, a closing assessment of what these encounters revealed about war, humanity, and the broader arc of history. The story of German prisoners in American camps is not defined by heroism or battle, but by perspective. It is the narrative of men trained to expect cruelty, sent to face an enemy they had been taught to fear, only to discover a system of discipline, abundance, and order that defied every preconception. Ice cream and Coca-Cola were not indulgences, they were symbols of a society capable of sustaining itself, of an industrial machine functioning under pressure, and of a moral framework that placed human treatment above vengeance. In the quiet barracks, on work details under open skies, and in interactions with guards and civilians, prisoners experienced a reality that propaganda could not erase. They saw the functioning arteries of a nation at war, understood its logistics, and measured its capacity firsthand. They encountered civility, consistency, and humane governance where they had expected chaos and cruelty. These experiences undermined the ideological constructs that had defined their lives and reshaped their understanding of what power, society, and warfare truly meant. The significance extends beyond the individual. These encounters demonstrated the strategic value of humane treatment and order in captivity. The United States preserved both operational control and moral authority, revealing that victory in war is not achieved solely through weapons, but through systems, infrastructure, and disciplined governance. For the prisoners, the lessons endured long after they returned to a devastated homeland, an imprint of order amidst disorder, of abundance amidst scarcity, and of capability amidst collapse. Ultimately, the camps became microcosms of possibility. They revealed the interplay between resources, human behavior, and societal resilience. They exposed the fragility of belief when confronted with fact, and the capacity for perception to shift under sustained exposure to reality. German POWs left not just as men who had survived captivity, but as witnesses to a civilization operating at a scale and with a stability that their previous worldview had failed to anticipate. In that quiet understanding lies the enduring truth. War does not only break nations, it also illuminates the nature of the societies that endure,